The stone in the King's Road was meant for war carts and iron-shod hooves, not the thin soles of a messenger's boots. Signa felt each jolt in her teeth. For 3 days, the fortress of Stonefall had been a smudge of grey against a greyer sky. Now it filled the world, a monument to power carved from the mountain's own heart. It was a place that ate light and small hopes for breakfast. Signa had precious little of either to spare. The letter was a clammy lump inside her tunic, tucked against her skin for safekeeping. It was, her lord had said, a petition, a request for aid, a final, desperate gamble. To Signa, it felt like a burial stone. She was delivering the last words of the Greywater Marsh, a place of reeds and mist and quiet dignity, now brought low by blight and a bitter winter. Guards in wolf-pelt cloaks watched her approach the gate. Their eyes were chips of ice. They did not see a desperate woman on a desperate errand. They saw a lone figure, cloaked in dark wool that had been fine once, before the rain and the road had had their way with it. They saw the silver clasp at her throat, a stylized heron that was the last bit of wealth from her own ruined family line. They saw the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin, and they mistook it for arrogance. "State your purpose," one of them grunted. His voice was a grind of rock on rock. Signa's own voice was a dry rasp. "A message for the Alpha King, from Lord Fisk of the Greywater Marsh." The guard exchanged a look with his counterpart. A flicker of something, confusion, annoyance, passed between them. "The king expects no message from the marshes." "Nevertheless, I have one." She resisted the urge to clutch the letter through her tunic. Weakness was a scent they would recognize. She straightened her spine, adding an inch to her height she did not feel she possessed. The second guard stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering on the silver heron clasp. "You were late." Signa frowned. Late? She had made the journey in 12 days, 2 faster than her lord had thought possible. "The welcome has grown cold," the guard said, his words a flat statement of fact. He gestured for the gate to be raised. "He does not appreciate being kept waiting." A knot of unease tightened in Signa's stomach. This was wrong. They were speaking of welcomes and waiting, not of petitions from a dying fief. But the gate was groaning open, a dark mouth offering to swallow her whole, and to refuse entry now would be an insult she could not afford. She had come this far. She would see it through. She stepped from the muddy road onto the clean swept stone of the outer courtyard. The air inside the walls was different. Still, heavy, smelling of steel and snow and something else, a wild, musky scent like a predator's den. Before she could orient herself, a woman with a face like a weathered map and hair the colour of frost appeared at her side. "This way," the woman commanded, her voice thin but sharp as a shard of glass. She didn't wait for a reply, already moving toward a smaller, private door set into the main keep. Signa had no choice but to follow, her worn boots echoing softly behind the woman's brisk, silent slippers. They moved through a labyrinth of corridors, the stone walls muffling the sounds of the fortress. There were no grand halls, no throngs of courtiers, just stone and silence, and the occasional grim-faced guard who would nod once at the old woman and then slide his gaze over Signa with an unreadable expression. "I have a letter," Signa began, her voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "It will wait," the woman snapped, not looking back. "Everything will wait. First, you must be made presentable." They stopped before a heavy oak door bound with iron. The old woman pushed it open, revealing a chamber that made Signa's breath catch. It was not a throne room, but it might as well have been. A fire roared in a hearth carved with snarling wolves. Furs thick enough to lose a hand in were draped over a massive bed. A silver basin steamed on a washstand, the water scented with pine. It was a room of impossible warmth and wealth. "My name is Birgit," the old woman said, finally turning to face her. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, scrutinized Sina from head to toe. The disapproval was palpable. "I am to see to your needs. His Majesty requires you attend him this evening." Sina's confusion was a physical weight. "Attend him? I am only a messenger. I must deliver my lord's letter, and then I will take my leave." Birgit let out a short, sharp sigh that was pure exasperation. "Your lord's games are of no concern to me. You are here. That is all that matters to the king. Now, the bath is ready. Your travel dust offends the very air." Before Sina could protest further, could find the words to cut through this thick wall of misunderstanding, Birgit was gone. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, the sound of the bolt sliding home as loud as a scream in the sudden silence. Sina stood frozen in the centre of the opulent room. The letter, her people's last hope, felt like a lead weight against her ribs. She was a prisoner. She had walked into a cage of velvet and fur, and the king, a king who was expecting someone else entirely, was waiting. The water in the silver basin had grown cool. Sina hadn't touched it. She had tried the door once, finding it as unyielding as the guard's face. Panic was a wild bird beating against her ribs, but she forced it down. Panic was a luxury. She had survived a blighted harvest, a winter that killed the weak, and a 12-day journey through wolf-haunted lands. She would survive this. She just didn't know how. She paced the room, a small, contained storm of anxiety. The fine wool of the rug was springy under her worn boots. She catalogued the details of her prison. One door, one window with iron bars disguised as decorative scrollwork overlooking a sheer drop. One hearth large enough to stand in. She was on a high floor of the keep. No easy escape. Her stomach rumbled, a traitorous, pathetic sound. On a low table near the fire sat a tray. Roasted meat, dark bread, a wedge of cheese, and a pitcher of what smelled like mulled wine. It was more food than she had seen in one place in a year. The scent of it was a physical assault, making her mouth water and her head spin. To eat, it felt like a surrender, an acceptance of this bizarre, terrifying role she had been thrust into. But not to eat it would be foolish. She needed her strength. She tore off a piece of bread, her hands shaking slightly. It was soft, rich with seeds. She ate it slowly, then another, then a sliver of the sharp, crumbly cheese. Each bite was an agony of pleasure and guilt. While she ate, her people were boiling shoe leather and digging for frozen roots. A faint scratching sound came from the door, followed by a child's high, clear voice. "Are you the new mother?" Sina froze, the bread halfway to her lips. She said nothing. The door handle rattled. A moment later, the bottom of the door swung inward. It was a split door, the top half still bolted. A small girl with hair like spun moonlight and Yorich's icy eyes peered in. She couldn't have been more than 5. She was dressed in a simple wool dress, her feet bare despite the chill of the stone corridor. "Birgit said not to bother the bride," the child announced, her voice solemn. "But you don't look like a bride. You look sad." Sina swallowed the lump in her throat. I'm not a bride, she said, her voice quiet. The girl, apparently satisfied with this, unlatched a small dog door set into the bottom of the main door and crawled through, followed by a gangly wolfhound pup that immediately began to investigate the food tray. The girl ignored him. She walked right up to Sina, tilted her head and asked, "Then why does my father have to marry you?" The directness of the question stole Sina's breath. Here was the truth, spoken by a child. The Alpha King was being forced into a marriage, and they thought she was the woman. "He doesn't," Sina whispered. "It's a mistake." "Oh," the girl considered this. "That's good. He doesn't want to. He's still sad about the scouring." She said the word with a child's careful imitation of adult gravity, as if it were a proper noun. The scouring. Another piece of a puzzle Sina didn't understand. "My name is Linnea," the girl offered, as if remembering her manners. "That's Moss." She pointed a small, grubby finger at the pup, who had managed to snatch a piece of meat and was swallowing it whole. Before Sina could reply, the main bolt on the door screeched as it was drawn back. The top half of the door swung open. Birgit stood there, her face a thundercloud. "Princess, you are not to be in here. You will disturb her grace." Linnea paid her no mind. She looked back at Sina. "Her grace is a funny name. You should be called Sina. It means victory." Sina stared at the child. How could she possibly know that name? It was a name from the old tongue, a name her mother had whispered to her in the cradle, a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in a decade. Birgit's face had gone from thunderous to pale. She swept into the room, scooping up Linnea. "Enough! Come! Your father will be here soon." Her eyes flickered to Sina, a new, sharp suspicion dawning in them. But it was too late. A shadow fell across the doorway, and the residual warmth from the fire seemed to vanish. A man stood there, tall and broad, filling the frame. He wore no crown, just simple black leathers, but there was no mistaking the power that radiated from him, like the cold from a winter stone. Scars traced a path from his temple into his dark hair, and his eyes were the same piercing ice as his daughter's, but where hers held childish curiosity, his held a grief so profound it had frozen solid. This was Yorick, the Alpha King, and he was looking straight past Sina, his gaze fixed on the half-eaten food on her plate, with an expression of utter contempt. Yorick did not look at her. His focus was a tangible thing, a weight in the room, and it was all directed at his daughter, who was squirming in Birgit's arms. "Linnea," he said. His voice was not loud, but it seemed to quiet the very crackle of the fire. It was a low baritone, rough at the edges, as if from disuse. "You were told to remain in your rooms." "She isn't a bride," Linnea announced, pointing at Sina. "Her name is Sina." A muscle jumped in Yorick's jaw. He finally, reluctantly, let his gaze fall upon the woman in the centre of the room. He saw a stranger, thin and tired, wearing a dusty cloak over a plain homespun dress. She was not the perfumed, pampered southern noblewoman he had been promised, and dreaded. She looked more like a pilgrim who had lost her way. But the silver heron at her throat was the agreed-upon token. The timing was correct. This had to be her. He had been warned the Lady Ameline was eccentric. Perhaps this was part of it. A test. A game. He was in no mood for games. Sina felt his gaze like a physical touch, cold and assessing. She held up the letter, a futile gesture. "Your Majesty, I am here to—" "I know why you are here." He cut her off, his voice flat. He turned his attention to Birgit. "See that she has what she needs. The conclave expects to greet her at moonrise." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned on his heel and was gone, the shadow lifting from the doorway as quickly as it had fallen. The corridor was empty. He had moved with the unnatural silence of a predator. Silence descended on the room, thick and suffocating. Birgit set Linnea down, her face grim. The child, for her part, ran back to Sina's side and slipped her small hand into hers. The trust was as shocking as it was unearned. "His heart is a frozen lake," Linnea whispered, as if sharing a great secret.
"My mother drowned in it." Birgit gasped, a sharp intake of breath. "Princess, that is not a story for strangers." She herded the child toward the door, her movements firm. "Come, we will find you a honey cake." This time, Linnea went without protest, but she looked back over her shoulder at Sina, her expression one of profound, adult seriousness. Sina was left alone again, the king's dismissal ringing in her ears. "I know why you are here." He thought she was a political bride. He thought her poverty-plain dress and her exhaustion were an affectation, a ploy. The contempt in his eyes had been unmistakable. He hated her already, this woman he was being forced to marry. And Sina was trapped in that woman's skin. The letter was still in her hand. She looked down at the crinkled parchment, the wax seal of the grey water heron, her lord's desperate plea. It was utterly useless. She sank onto the edge of the massive bed, the furs sighing around her. For the first time since leaving the marsh, she felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. Later, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple outside her barred window, Birgit returned. The old woman's face was set in stony lines, but she carried a bundle of deep blue velvet. She laid it on the bed. It was a dress, exquisitely made, embroidered with silver thread in patterns of winter branches. "You will wear this," Birgit said. It was not a request. "I cannot," Sina said, her voice hollow. "This is not for me." "The king has commanded it." Birgit's eyes narrowed. "Do you mean to defy him on your first night under his roof? Is that the game your southern court plays? To show your power by disobedience?" Sina shook her head, weary to her bones. "I am not from a southern court. I am from the Greywater Marsh. My name is Sina. My lord is Fisker. He is starving. My people are starving. I brought a letter." The words tumbled out, a desperate torrent. Birgit listened, her expression unreadable. When Sina was finished, the old woman was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "The Lady Ameline of the Sunstone Pack was promised to the king. A pact sealed a year ago to end the border wars. She was to arrive today, wearing a clasp of a silver heron." She gestured to Sina's throat. "You wear the clasp. You arrived on the appointed day. What else am I to believe?" "My clasp is my own," Sina whispered, her hand going to the familiar, cool metal. It had been her mother's. "It is the sigil of my family line, not of this Lady Ameline." "A coincidence, then," Birgit said, her voice laced with disbelief. A powerful, dangerous coincidence. Put on the dress. Her tone was softer now, less accusatory. There was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Pity, perhaps, or fear. Tonight, you will be silent. You will be beautiful. You will do nothing to anger him further. And perhaps, if the spirits are kind, you will live to see the sunrise. The velvet was heavy as armor. Sina stood numbly as Birgitte dressed her, pulling her hair back from her face and securing it with silver pins that felt cold against her scalp. She was a doll, being prepared for a play she didn't know the lines to. When it was done, Birgitte stepped back. "There," she said, a grudging approval in her voice. "You almost look the part." Almost. Sina looked at her reflection in the polished silver of the water basin. A stranger stared back, a pale, haunted woman in a queen's dress. The only thing she recognized was the fear in her own eyes. The day passed in a haze of unreality. No one came for her. The silence of the room was broken only by the crackle of the fire, which a silent servant refueled while refusing to meet her eyes. Sina did not touch the new tray of food that was left for her. The hunger in her belly had been replaced by a cold, hard knot of dread. She kept replaying the scene with the king, his dismissal, his contempt, and his daughter's strange, sad words. His heart is a frozen lake.
My mother drowned in it.
What had happened to the queen, the first mother? What was the scouring? Restless, she went to the door. She did not expect it to be unlocked, but she pressed her ear to the cold wood. She could hear the low murmur of guards, the distant clang of steel from the training yard. And another sound, closer. A high, thin whine, like a distressed animal. She remembered the wolfhound pup, Moss. He had been with Linnea. He must be outside. Acting on an impulse she didn't understand, she tried the handle. To her immense surprise, it turned. The bolt had not been thrown. Perhaps they thought the locked room was enough, or perhaps in the confusion it had been forgotten. Freedom was a breath away. She could walk out. She could try to find her way out of the fortress, back to the road. But where would she go? Back to the marsh, empty-handed, to admit failure? No, she was a messenger. She had not yet delivered her message. She opened the door a crack. The two guards stationed there barely glanced at her. Their attention was on the corridor. And there, huddled against the far wall, was the pup. He was shivering violently, a low, constant keen coming from his throat. "He's fine," one of the guards grumbled without looking at her. "Just missing his mother. She was lost in the last hunt." Sina's heart ached. An orphan, just like Linnea. Without a word, she slipped past the guards, knelt, and gathered the trembling pup into her arms. He was all bony angles and oversized paws. He whined and licked her chin, his small body a furnace against her. She carried him back into her room and shut the door. The guards said nothing. They were Jorich men, tasked with guarding the bride-to-be, not her strange whims. Inside, she sat before the fire, cradling the pup. She tore off a piece of meat from the untouched tray and offered it to him. He devoured it greedily. She dipped her fingers in the water pitcher and let him lick them clean. Slowly, the shivering subsided, and he curled into a tight ball in her lap, his breathing evening out in sleep. Sina stroked his soft fur, the simple, repetitive motion a balm to her frayed nerves. She was not a lady. She was not a bride. She was a woman who knew how to soothe a frightened animal. It was a small, solid piece of truth in a world that had turned to smoke and mirrors. Hours later, a soft sound made her look up. The dog door swung open, and Linnea crawled through, as silent as a little ghost. She saw Sina with the pup, and her solemn face broke into a small, rare smile. She didn't speak, just crawled onto the thick furs beside Sina, laid her head on Sina's lap, and fell asleep almost instantly. Sina sat there, trapped between a sleeping child and a sleeping pup, the firelight dancing on their faces. She felt a strange, fierce wave of protectiveness for these two motherless creatures. It was a feeling she understood, a feeling that had roots deep in the marsh, in the care for things that were small and vulnerable. She began to hum, a low, reedy tune her own mother used to sing, a song about the marsh lights that guided lost fishermen home. She didn't know she was being watched. From the shadows of the corridor, Jorich stood, motionless. He had come to check the guards, to ensure his unwanted bride was secure. He had found the door ajar. His first instinct was cold fury. But then he had heard the humming. He had peered inside, and he saw this scene of impossible peace. The woman he was supposed to loathe, the woman who represented the political chains being wrapped around him, was sitting on his floor, cradling his grieving pup and his broken-hearted daughter. She was humming a song that sounded like wind in the reeds, and for the first time in a year, the icy fortress of his heart felt a tremor, a tiny hairline crack. He noticed she wore none of the priceless jewels Birgit had been instructed to give her. She just wore the velvet dress and a sleeping child. He backed away as silently as he had come, the image burned into his mind. The summons came at dawn, not a command to attend him in the throne room, but a quiet word from Birgit that the king requested her presence, in the kennels. Sina went, leaving Moss and a still sleeping Linnea curled together on the furs by the fire. The pup had barely left her side, a small, warm shadow. Birgit led her through the cold morning air to a low stone building that smelled of hay and hound and clean animal musk. The air was sharp with the promise of more snow. Jorich was there, kneeling on the stone floor beside a massive grey wolf. The animal was ancient, its fur threaded with silver, its muzzle white with age. Its breathing was a shallow, ragged affair. The king was stroking its head, his large, scarred hands surprisingly gentle. He did not look up when Sina entered. "This is Ulf," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He ran with me for 15 years. Now he dies." The statement was blunt, devoid of self-pity, but the grief was a palpable thing in the cold air. Sina understood. This was a test. He had brought the pampered southern lady here to see her flinch, to see her wrinkle her nose at the smell of sickness and death. He wanted her to fail, to prove she was everything he believed her to be. But Sina was not a southern lady. She was a woman from the marsh, where life and death were intimate neighbours. She looked past the king, past the test, and saw only the animals suffering. She moved closer, her boots silent on the straw-strewn floor. "His flank is hot," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "The fever is in the wound." Jorich's hand stilled on the wolf's fur. He finally looked at her. His icy eyes held a flicker of surprise. He had not expected this. Sina knelt on the other side of the great wolf, her velvet dress pooling in the dirty straw. She didn't care. She ran her hand gently along the animal's side, her fingers searching, knowing. She found it, a swelling, hot and hard beneath the thick pelt. An old puncture wound, poorly healed and now festering. "He is in much pain," she murmured, more to the wolf than to the king. A poultice of willow bark would ease the fever, and comfrey root, mashed, to draw out the poison. She spoke with the simple authority of experience. In the marsh, you learned to make do. You learned which leaves drew out infection, which barks eased pain, which mosses staunched bleeding. This was a language she knew far better than the courtly silence she had been commanded to adopt. Yorick stared at her hands, steady and sure on his dying friend's flank, at her face, intent and focused, all traces of fear gone, replaced by a quiet competence. She had not asked permission. She had seen a need, and she had met it. "You are a healer?" he asked, his voice low. "I am a messenger," she corrected him softly. "But in my home, everyone learns to tend the sick. We have no one else." The silence stretched between them, punctuated by the wolf's laboured breaths. He was watching her, really watching her for the first time. Seeing the person, not the symbol. Seeing the capable hands, the clear eyes, the surprising calm. "What did you say your name was?" he asked, the question sharp. "Sina." He repeated it, a soft echo in the cold kennel. Sina. It sounded different in his mouth. Not a name he was told, but a name he was discovering. A seed of doubt, planted the night before, began to sprout in the frozen ground of his certainty. This was not the woman he had been warned about. This was someone else entirely. And for the first time since his mate's death, Yorick felt a flicker of something other than grief and duty. He felt curiosity. "Get her what she needs," Yorick commanded the guard, a big, surly man named Stellan, whose scarred face suggested he'd lost more fights than he'd won. Stellan grunted, his expression making it clear he thought this was all a fool's errand. But he disappeared to find the herbs Signa had requested. Yorick did not leave. He stayed, watching as Signa worked. She spoke to the old wolf, Ulf, in a low, soothing murmur, her hands gentle as she cleaned the festering wound with warm water. When Stellan returned with a bundle of willow bark and a gnarled comfrey root, she thanked him with a small, genuine nod that seemed to fluster the big man. She prepared the poultice with an unhurried efficiency, her movements economical and precise. She was not performing for him. Yorick knew the difference. He had spent his life surrounded by people performing. This was different. This was purpose. As she applied the warm mash to the wolf's flank, the great beast, which had been tense with pain, let out a long, low sigh and rested its head on its paws. "He will need fresh water and a new poultice every few hours," she said, wiping her hands on a piece of clean straw. She looked up at Yorick, her eyes direct. And he should not lie on the cold stone. Yorick simply nodded. He looked from her to the now resting wolf and back. "You have a gentle hand." "It is a necessary one," she replied, and he understood the world of meaning in those few words. Later that day, as she was changing the poultice, a shadow fell over her. It was not Yorick. This man was slighter, his clothes finer. He had the same dark hair as the king, but his face was handsome in a way that felt polished and sharp, his smile too quick, too bright. "So, this is the little marsh bird who has so captivated our king," the man said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. He circled her, his eyes taking in her borrowed velvet dress, now stained with mud and herb mash. "I am Valerius, the king's cousin." Signa rose slowly to her feet, placing herself between the man and the sleeping wolf. She did not like this man. His scent was wrong, cloying, like flowers blooming on a grave. "I had heard the Lady Ameline was a great beauty," Valerius continued, his smile never reaching his eyes. A jewel of the South. You are not what I expected. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A word of advice. Our Yorich has a fondness for broken things. He tries to fix them, but some things are too broken to be mended. It would be a shame if your alliance was shattered before it even began. The threat was unmistakable, veiled in silken words. Signa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the kennels. She met his gaze and held it. I am not broken, she said, her voice low and steady. And I am not his. Valerius's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected fear, or flirtation, or deference. He had not expected this quiet, unadorned defiance. It intrigued him. It angered him. We shall see, he murmured, and then he was gone, leaving a trail of perfume and menace in his wake. Signa's hands were shaking. She forced them still, turning her attention back to Ulf. But the peace of the kennels had been shattered. She did not see Yorich again until nightfall. He appeared at the kennel door as she was laying fresh straw for the wolf. He carried a heavy fur cloak, dark and unmarked. He didn't enter. He simply stood in the doorway, a bulwark against the gathering dark. He had seen Valerius leave. He had seen the look on Signa's face. He knew his cousin's ways. He stepped forward, and without a word, he draped the heavy cloak over her shoulders. His fingers did not touch her, but she felt the warmth of his body from the fur, the scent of pine and cold air that clung to him. The cloak settled around her, a shield of impossible weight and softness. The nights are cold, was all he said. Signa clutched the fur, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was not a declaration. It was not an apology. It was a gesture, an action. It was the way this silent, grieving king spoke. He was offering her his protection, and in the cold, dangerous fortress of Stonefall, it was the most precious gift she could imagine. The deception was a stone in Signa's shoe, a constant, painful pressure. Every kind word from Linnea, every grudgingly respectful nod from Stellan, every quiet moment of shared duty with Yorich in the kennels twisted the knot of her guilt tighter. Ulf was improving. The fever had broken, and he had even taken a little broth from her hand. This small victory felt like a theft. The news came via Birgit, whose demeanour towards Signa had softened from outright hostility to a wary, confused truce. A rider from the Sunstone Pack has reached the lower valley, the old woman announced, her face grim as she set down a tray of fresh bread and broth. Lady Ameline's party was delayed by a rockslide in the high pass. They will be here by tomorrow's moon. Tomorrow. The word hung in the air like an axe. Signa's hands stilled. She could not eat. Then they will know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. They will all know. Birgit sat down heavily on the stool opposite her, a rare breach of protocol. The old woman looked tired, her face a web of fine lines. I have served this house for 50 years. I served the queen that was, and I held King Jorich when he was a babe. I know the look of a lie. Her pale eyes fixed on Signa. And you, girl, are a terrible liar. But you are also not the viper I was led to expect. You are kind to the child. You are gentle with the beast. You eat plain bread when you could demand sweet cakes. It does not add up. The old woman's searching gaze was too much to bear. The truth, the real truth, rose up in Signa's throat, choking her. She reached into her tunic, her fingers finding the worn, folded parchment. She pulled it out and smoothed it on the table. The wax seal was cracked, the paper softened by the heat of her body. This is why I came, she said. She pushed it across the table to Birgit. My name is Signa of the Greywater Marsh. My people are dying. This is not a tribute, it is a plea. Birgit picked up the letter. Her lips moved as she read, the elegant script of Signa's lord a stark contrast to the desperation of the words. She read of the failed harvest, the blight in the reed beds, the sickness that was taking the children and the old. She read of a proud people brought to their knees, begging for a lifeline from a king who had all but forgotten them. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and handed it back. She was silent for a long time. You have put your head in a wolf's mouth, Birgit said at last, her voice rough. Valerius has been whispering in the king's council. He says the border pact is fragile, that any insult to the Lady Ameline will bring war. If you are revealed as an impostor before the true bride arrives— She didn't need to finish the sentence. I never meant for any of this, Signa whispered, her hands clenched in her lap. Intentions are for children and poets, Birgit said sharply. We are judged by our actions. She stood, her spine rigid. When the king learns of this, he will be wroth. He does not suffer deception. She paused at the door. But he is a just man. He may hate the liar, but he may yet hear the message. She left Signa with that sliver of hope, a tiny, fragile thing in the face of the coming storm. Meanwhile, in the king's solar, Yorick was staring at a map. A scout had just returned, not from the Sunstone territories, but from the High Pass. The rock slide was deliberate, Your Majesty, the scout reported, his face grim. The charges were set to block the pass for a week, no more, and the placement was expert, meant to delay, not to kill. Yorick's eyes narrowed. He traced a line on the map. The pass was the only swift route from the south. To delay the bride was to delay the alliance. To delay the alliance was to create instability.
And instability was the soil in which his cousin Valerius's ambitions grew best. He thought of Signa, her steady hands on his wolf, the story she told his daughter about marshlights, her quiet defiance in the face of Valerius's threats. He thought of the silver heron clasp, a coincidence, Birgit had called it. Yorick did not believe in coincidences. He believed in plans. He had been so focused on the trap of the marriage that he had failed to see the shape of the cage being built around it. He pushed back from the table. The pieces were there, scattered and confusing, but they were beginning to form a picture he did not like. A false bride who felt more real than the true one. A convenient rock slide. A cousin who smiled too much. Summon the woman, Signa, he commanded the guard at his door. Bring her to the throne room, and bring my cousin. The game, whatever it was over. It was time to see the cards on the table. The throne room was a cavern of shadow and judgment. The Iron Wolf throne, forged from the weapons of fallen enemies, dominated the dais. It was a seat no one could occupy comfortably. Yorick sat upon it now, and he looked as if he had been forged from the same metal. Cold, hard, unyielding. Signa was brought before him. She still wore the borrowed velvet dress, but she had taken off the fur cloak. She would face this on her own. Her hair was unbound, a dark river falling over her shoulders. She looked less like a lady and more like a captured dryad, wild and out of place. Valerius stood to the side of the throne, a smug, knowing smile on his face. He believed this was the moment of his triumph, the unmasking of the impostor. Stellan and 2 other guards stood by the door, their faces impassive stone. Yorick's eyes, chips of winter ice, were fixed on Signa.
The room was silent enough to hear a heart beat. Signa was sure they could all hear hers. "They tell me the Lady Ameline's party is but a day from our gates," Yorick said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. "They tell me she was delayed by a rock slide." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "They tell me many things." His gaze did not leave her face. "But you have told me nothing. It is time for that to change." He leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of the throne. The scars on his face seemed to deepen in the torchlight. "Tell me, who are you?" The question was a blade aimed at her heart. This was the moment. She could beg, she could weep, she could invent a story. But she was tired of lies. She was tired of being a shadow in someone else's story. She lifted her chin. Her voice, when it came, was clear and steady, with the quiet resonance of the marshlands she called home. "My name is Signa." She said it not as an apology, but as a declaration. "I am from the Greywater Marsh, a holding under your protection, though I think you have forgotten it. I am the daughter of the line of Kenna, who served your grandmother." Valerius let out a short, derisive laugh. "A hedge witch with delusions of grandeur." Signa ignored him. Her eyes were only for the king. "I came to Stonefall as a messenger for my lord Fisk. Not with tribute, but with a plea. My people are starving. The winter blight has taken our harvest and our hope. I was sent to deliver this." She reached into her tunic and pulled out the letter. She walked the 3 steps to the dais and held it out to him. Her hand did not tremble. Yorick did not take it. His eyes were locked on hers, searching, demanding. Valerius stepped forward. "She is a charlatan, cousin, a spy sent to disrupt the alliance. Seize her. When the Lady Ameline arrives and finds this creature has been living in her chambers, wearing her clothes." He let the threat hang in the air. As if on cue, the great doors of the throne room swung open. A herald, breathless, ran in. "Your Majesty, a party approaches. Banners of the Sunstone Pack. It is the Lady Ameline." The trap was sprung.
Valerius's smile was one of pure, predatory triumph. He had won. He had maneuvered his cousin into an impossible position. To accept this impostor was to insult a powerful ally. To cast her out was to admit he had been duped in his own home. But he had misjudged his king. Yorick looked from Valerius's triumphant face to Signa's quiet defiance. He looked at the letter she still held out to him, and in that moment, all the pieces clicked into place. The convenient rock slide, the whispered poison from his cousin, the strange, brave woman who calmed his daughter and healed his wolf. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took the letter from her hand. The arrival of the Sunstone banners was a thunderclap in the charged silence of the throne room. Valerius's victory seemed absolute. He turned to Yorick, his face a mask of feigned concern. "Cousin, you must act. We must have this impostor thrown in the dungeons before the Lady Ameline sets foot in this hall. We can say she was a deranged peasant. The insult can be contained." Yorick did not look at him. His gaze was on the worn parchment in his hand. He broke the seal and read. The stark, desperate words of Lord Fisk were a damning indictment, not of Signa, but of him. Of his failure to see beyond the borders of his own grief, his own political struggles. He had let a part of his kingdom wither
while he negotiated for alliances he didn't even want. He folded the letter and tucked it into his tunic, a gesture of safekeeping that was not lost on Signa. Then he rose from the Iron Wolf throne. He was no longer a grieving man, but a king. "You are right, cousin," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "An insult has been offered. A plot has been uncovered." He walked down the steps of the dais until he was standing on the same level as Signa. He was a mountain of a man, and she was a reed beside him, but she did not shrink away. "You sought to saddle me with a political bride to weaken my position, surrounding me with southern interests and cutting me off from my own people. You engineered this delay to sow chaos and make me appear a fool." Valerius paled. "I did this for you, to secure the kingdom." "You did this for a title that is not yours to claim," Yorick countered, his voice like the crack of ice. He turned his back on his cousin, a deliberate, final insult. He faced the assembled guards and the few stunned courtiers who had witnessed the drama. "For a year I have mourned," he said, his voice ringing with a power they had not heard in months. "For a year, this keep has been a house of ghosts. I was told an alliance would heal the kingdom. I was wrong. Truth will heal the kingdom. Loyalty will heal it." He turned to Signa. He did not touch her. He did not proclaim her his mate or his queen. He offered her something far more valuable: a choice. "The Lady Ameline comes with armies and alliances and a pact of paper and ink," he said, his voice softer now, for her alone. "You came with a truth and a plea for your people. I have been a king of stone walls and iron pacts. You have reminded me that a kingdom is made of people." He looked into her eyes, and she saw not a king demanding, but a man asking. "The wolves do not choose a mate for pedigree or power. They choose for strength of heart. The spirits have sent a true North woman to my door, and I was too blind to see it." He took a breath. "I will not command you. I will not claim you. I will ask. Signa of the Greywater Marsh, will you stay?" The question hung in the air, a breathtaking reversal. He was giving her all the power. She could say no. She could demand aid for her people and walk away, her duty done. She would be safe. Valerius saw his plot unraveling into a nightmare. "She is a nobody, a fraud. Guards, seize her!" he shrieked, his composure finally cracking. But the guards did not move. Their eyes were on their king, and on Stellan, the gruff kennelmaster, who had drawn his sword and now stood squarely between Valerius and Signa. "The king asked a question," Stellan growled. Signa looked at the king, at this powerful, wounded man who was offering her not a crown, but a partnership, who was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. She thought of her starving people. She thought of a sad little girl and a lonely pup. She thought of a home. "I will stay," she said, her voice clear and strong. It was all the signal Yorick needed. "Valerius," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "You are charged with treason against the crown. You sought to destabilize the kingdom for your own gain. You will be held to account." Valerius, cornered and desperate, drew a hidden dagger. He lunged, not for the king, but for Signa, the source of his ruin. It was a fatal mistake. He underestimated the king's speed. He underestimated Stellan's loyalty. Yorick moved like a shadow, his arm intercepting the blow. Stellan moved like a battering ram, his shoulder crashing into Valerius's chest. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. When it was over, Valerius was disarmed and on his knees, his face a mask of disbelief. The great doors opened again. The herald, looking flustered, announced the formal arrival of Lady Ameline and her retinue. Yorick did not even glance towards the door. He looked at Signa, his eyes holding a question, a promise, and the dawn of a new, unguarded hope. The kingdom had been saved, not by a political pact, but by a messenger with the truth in her hands. The spring came late to the Greywater Marsh, but it came. The sunlight, when it finally broke through the mists, seemed to fall on a different land. New thatch shone golden on the roofs of the cottages. The reed beds, cleared of blight, were thick with green shoots. In the newly ploughed fields, children laughed as they planted seed grain, their bellies full for the first time in memory. Signa stood on a low hill overlooking the village, a sack of seed potatoes at her feet. She wore a simple linen dress and sturdy boots caked with the rich, dark mud of her home. There was no velvet here, no silver embroidery. She had never felt more like a queen. A cart, laden with supplies from Stonefall, rumbled up the track. The man leading the draught horse was tall and broad-shouldered. He wore no crown, no fine leathers, just a simple wool tunic that did nothing to hide the strength in his arms as he guided the horse to a stop. The scars on his face were softened by the gentle light, no longer marks of grief, but simply part of the landscape of the man he had become. "The last of the grain for the North Fields," Yorick said, his voice a low rumble that was as familiar to her now as the cry of the marsh birds. "Good," Signa said, a small smile touching her lips. "The soil is ready for it." A flash of movement in the reeds below caught her eye. A girl with hair like spun moonlight was chasing a great grey wolfhound, nearly grown now, his paws comically large. Linnea's laughter, clear and bright, carried on the wind. Moss, the pup Signa had rescued, bounded after them, a happy, clumsy shadow. They were home, all of them. Yorick came to stand beside her. He didn't speak for a long moment, just watched his daughter, his kingdom, his life, being reborn in this quiet, misty corner of the world. He had honoured the Lady Ameline, sending her back to her father not with a rejection, but with a new treaty, one of mutual respect and trade, not of marriage. It had cost him politically, but it had earned him his soul. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. The touch was light, familiar, a conversation in itself. It spoke of shared nights by the fire, of whispered fears and quiet hopes, of building a life together, one day, one sack of seed at a time. "Birgit complains that you are a terrible influence," he said, a hint of humour in his voice. "She says Linnea now prefers mud pies to honey cakes." "Birgit complains that the sun rises in the east," Signa countered, her smile widening. "She will be happy when we return to Stonefall." "And you?" he asked, his gaze serious. "Will you be happy to return?" Signa looked out at the marsh, at the silver ribbons of water weaving through the green. This was the land of her blood and her bones. But Stonefall, with its cold stone and its warm hearths, with its lonely child and its grieving king, had become the home of her heart. "My home is with you," she said simply. It was the truest thing she had ever said. He slipped his hand into hers, his large fingers engulfing her own. It was a comfortable, solid weight. A promise. "The tide is coming in," he said, looking towards the distant estuary where the sea met the marsh. It was a simple observation, a fact of their new life. But for Signa, it held the world. The tide was coming in, washing away the hunger and the fear. bringing with it the promise of renewal, of growth, of a future she had never dared to dream of. She squeezed his hand, her heart full, and watched the water rise.